Hello and welcome to the May edition of the Grand Rapids Drupal user group. Today, we are going to be talking about services, and this will be a kind of a general intro that could serve for people who are perhaps used to developing sites in Drupal 7 and have done some Drupal 8 things by example, but haven't really understood why things are architected the way they are in Drupal 8 and 9. And we'll connect a little bit with some more general object-oriented principles you might see in other frameworks and languages. And our hope is to answer the questions of what services are and dependency injection, which is a big part of what we're going to be talking about today, and also why it's a good idea to use them. And we're going to probably not talk too much about the specifics of how to implement all of these ideas today, but we will have a follow-up session where we'll talk about those details. So I'm going to get started by talking a little bit about the history of how things used to work in Drupal, because that my background stretches back to Drupal 4. So I've seen a bit about how this evolves. So Drupal came originally from a very procedural place where when you were to go to a page, that would resolve through originally one of a few different PHP scripts, depending on the endpoint you went to, which then pulled in the right things from the database and displayed the right pages. Eventually a menu system came in place and kind of took over routing. And so when you went to a page, the database would basically look up the cached information from the menu hook to figure out which endpoint to serve up, load in the right include file, and run all the scripts in there to produce output. There is, at that point, in order to get information onto a page that didn't come from the exact script that was running, that's the kind of the whole idea of a framework, is that you have multiple pieces that can work together. So there were a couple systems that made that happen. One was the module system. The module system was a very simple way of packaging related functionality. So a Drupal module, and a lot of this remains true today, but Drupal module was a collection of an informational file that, originally just a PHP file with a .module extension, and later some informational files that would say what this module is about, and then when you turned it on, there would be one central module file that would have functions that were named in particular ways, and it was in a folder, so that module could contain other support files, either other PHP files to load or JavaScript, CSS, images. So again, most of that's still true today. The module file itself, though, in order for any code in that to run, what the system was, the Drupal hook system, which still exists, though it's reduced in importance today. And in order for anything to happen, Drupal would look through installed modules for functions that were named with the module name, and then an underscore, and then the name of the hook. And this was a procedural implementation of an object-oriented philosophy, really. There were a lot of things in Drupal, like nodes and modules, that were kind of conceptually objects, but not not implemented as objects. And a lot of that has to do with what PHP was capable of when Drupal was originally developed. The object-oriented features in the PHP language were were not very robust at the time. And so the idea of sending messages from one object to another was basically accomplished in a fashion via hooks, which are sort of like a publish subscribe model, but have some limitations just because of the nature of how they're designed. So so now we're going to be talking about services, which are one of the object-oriented features of Drupal 8 and 9 that are gradually supplanting all of the older procedural methods. And to set the stage for that, in Drupal 7, when you wanted a module to have functionality that other modules could use, the two ways you would do that would be to have a public function, a global function that was prefixed with the module's name. And Drupal would give you some convenience methods for knowing whether the module was turned on and whether that function exists so that you could simply call it. It's a very procedural idea with the object-oriented trapping of encapsulation, where the module has a contract that methods or that functions that are not preceded with an underscore are going to be the public API of that module, which was followed with some rigor, some degree of rigor, depending on the contributed module you're looking at, for example. And then the other system being hooks, which are the opposite direction, where a module says, rather than the module saying, I'm providing this function, it's saying, I'm looking for a function that looks like this. And that's kind of that still exists, and you'll see that more though implemented through things like plugins and sometimes, depending on the type of thing the hook was used for, a lot of it was data really more than functionality. So those things are replaced by YAML files in many cases. So so again, today we're talking about services. So in Drupal 8 and 9, when you have in a module you're writing, if you have functionality you would like any other code to call, there are a few places you can put that, but one of the most common is a simple service, which is basically taking the concepts of public functions, and rather than relying on naming to namespace things, it relies on actual PHP object-oriented features of declared namespaces and classes and public and protected methods to enforce some of the things that were done by convention before. And that's really the trajectory here is taking things that people were asked to do and forcing some good behaviors out of people instead, by having the programming language and framework enforce some good habits. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to go over first, I think, what a service actually is, and then we'll go on to the more meaty stuff from there.
Yeah, and I think it's just a continuation of some of the things you said there, because one of the things in the Drupal 7 days with the hook system in general, like you said, if you want to expose functionality, you did it via this publicly exposed function. One of the requirements was that then that every function in the entire Drupal ecosystem had to be uniquely named, because there was not taking advantage of the object-oriented principle of namespaces. So with namespaces, two classes can even have the same name as long as they're in different namespaces. Then they're known to be different classes, and that really, those object-oriented kind of introductory principles is really the kind of basis of or foundation of what services does. And then dependency injection, which we're going to talk about, I think, briefly, because services is kind of maybe a cousin or a certain way of implementing dependency injection, I guess you could say, that Drupal does. And services is really, it was really kind of falls under the umbrella of the concept called abstraction. So, which is, a generic coding or development principle, which says I want to hide the details and hide the need to know all the details in order to use something. So abstraction, one of the places we talk about abstraction a lot is abstracting the database layer, for example. And what that means is that I don't want to have to know the particular SQL syntax for doing everything to the database. And I don't want to have to know the difference between the nuances of using MySQL versus Microsoft SQL Server, et cetera. So when we talk about abstracting that, we're saying we're kind of wrapping that in a way that's much easier to use, and and it's more generic, and again hides the details, hides the need to know all of those details. And that's what services are doing. So services are saying, here's this big chunk of functionality, and we're gonna create this window into it that is via a established and standardized mechanism, and make it easier for you to consume without having to know a lot of the details. And as it relates to dependency injection, that detail can be even what class is even providing this functionality. So we don't even need to know that. So even if we are kind of in between the old, very procedural style of doing things and true services / dependency injection, we still could use classes in an object-oriented way. But every time we want to use a class, we have to spin it up, as it's called, equal new class name. And one of the key things there is that when we do that, we're calling the constructor on that class, which means that we have to provide everything that constructor is asking for. So in some cases, that means that's some other class that we also have had to create beforehand. And those things can chain down, very deeply. So in order to use this functionality in this class, we've got to know all kinds of details about how it works, about these things that it needs in order to work, and then the things that those things need, et cetera, et cetera. And it places a real heavy burden on the developer then to be able to use those things, because there's a lot of knowledge that's required. So enter services. So services is a way of wrapping that functionality in a way to make it easy to get to. And I'm going to share my screen. As Jonathan said, we're going to get a little more into the nuts and bolts of how to do this in a subsequent session, but we do want to kind of just look at a couple things really briefly here. And this is, oops, guess I got to push the share button. There we go. This is the example of the services that are registered or exposed, you might say, by this module. And this is the pattern that the module name .services.yaml sits in the root of the module. And there's a defined standardized structure that this has. And so if we look at one of these, you see this class, and again, we'll get into these details, but this is telling Drupal system that this is the specific class that is going to be the provider of this service. But what that means for all of the rest of my code, everywhere in the rest of my entire application, is that all I really need to know is the name of that service. And in fact, this is an example, like I talked about, where this service actually needs some parameters. It needs some things to work. It needs the entity type manager, it needs the request stack, and it needs a logger channel. So in order to do that with the equal new, in order to use this class with the equal new line of code, I would have to create the entity type manager. I don't even know what an entity type manager is, but I'd have to create one in order to use this helper service. Request, I don't know how to get the request stack, so I got to figure out how to get the request stack, how to create that. And again, those things in turn might have dependencies that I'd have to know about and create in order to use those, in order to ultimately get to creating a equal new Drupal subsite helper service. So instead, what I can do to consume this is just say I just want to use this service.
And I think you might need to reshare your.
Oh, did it just die? What just happened?
I think it's not the right window.
Okay, let me, because it.
There it goes.
Okay, you're looking at the code now?
Yep.
Okay. So did it share at all at first?
Yeah, it did, and then it just stopped.
Weird. Okay. I went to move the Zoom meeting itself, and maybe when I did that. Anyway, so in order to use this class in an equal new statement, I would have to know about the 3 parameters that its constructor needs. But what services allow me to do in Drupal is just say, as long as I know the name of the service, Drupal will kind of take care of the rest of this. And the way that it does that is with dependency injection, which we'll get to in a minute. And I just want to show this top section here as this first service that I have defined here, which is kind of a real practical way of maybe getting your head around this concept of not needing to know the details. And what this does is, as is often the case, we want all of the logging to the Drupal log for this module to all be in the same, what Drupal calls a channel, so that when you're looking at the log report, they're grouped by these channels. So core has its own channel, PHP has its own channel, but typically every module will have at least one channel where all of its errors and warnings and messages are grouped, so that then you can filter by that channel. So without this service being registered this way, all the places where I want to do any logging all throughout my module's code would need to know the name of the channel, which in this case, I'm using mydu_custom, which means that if there's a typo that creeps in anywhere in any place I type that wrong, then all of a sudden now I've got 2 channels. It's the messages in the log are not going to be together. And or I decide to change it at some point, but don't catch all of the places. So this is, again, kind of an abstraction now of the logging capabilities for this module. And it creates a service with this name. And in this syntax here, it's just saying it inherits from this base logging class. And the key thing here is that it's going to pass that argument of that logging channel name. So that what I do then all throughout this module is, rather than ask for that logging channel directly, I just asked for this service. And so now there's only one place where this is defined, and there's only one place that even knows the detail of what this channel name is called. So again, hiding the details, hiding the need to know the details of how it's used. So now my code that wants to log an error message doesn't even need to know the name of the channel. All I've got to do is standardize the use of this service. And as I mentioned previously, you can see here this third parameter of this other service is actually that logging service. So in that way, I know that this service is going to adhere to this consistent logging within the module by using the logger channel service itself. So that's again a kind of that's not directly dependency injection, but it's sort of a good practical way of saying of demonstrating that idea of hiding the need to know some of those details.
Yeah, I just want to connect that briefly with, again, people who are coming from a Drupal 7 background, to say that a lot of this is not new. It's just done in a way that, again, enforces good behavior, because I'm going to just share my screen for a second. I'm just going to show you in Drupal 6. If you were going to make a database query, you instead of PHP has database functions, but instead of calling those, you would call this DB query with your query in it, and it would do the substitution and escaping and stuff. But Drupal works with MySQL and PostgreSQL, and you might be using either one, and the details are different, but you would call the same function for those. And it turns out if you do a search for that function, you find that it exists in two separate files with the same argument and description, but the implementation is different. So effectively, they were simulating the idea of having two services with an equivalent interface by just loading one file or the other. It's just that all of this is done more elegantly in the method that Dan is describing.
Yeah, and I think the final piece is just to talk a little bit about dependency injection as a more generic thing, especially in case somebody comes from that background, and how services relate to it. So dependency injection is sort of a modern, common, object-oriented mechanism or functionality that lots of languages and lots of frameworks have. Very prevalent in the .NET framework, which is a lot of my background. Laravel has its own system of dependency injection. And so it's a real common thing. And one of the concepts in dependency injection is the idea of a container. So you'll see code like this a lot when you start getting into this. You'll see references to this container idea. And that's again,
I'll need to reshare, sorry, because I stole it from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this idea of a container is a common dependency injection concept. And you can think of the container as sort of the registry or the Google for services or objects, or the phone book if you're a little older like me. The container is the place that knows the relationship between all of these services and the class that is going to be the one, what actually runs the code. And so all of these frameworks have different ways that these things get registered. And that's where Drupal services kind of come into play. So Drupal services is the mechanism by which these things get registered in the dependency injection container. And that's a little different than other languages. And its usage is a little bit different, because what's typical for straight dependency injection, there's different ways to do dependency injection, but the most common is called constructor dependency injection. And in a lot of these other frameworks, all you have to do to consume these is just reference that type in your constructor. And the framework automatically figures out that it has a registered entry for that and gives you the instantiated and hydrated class that implements what you're looking for. So the Drupal services mechanism and these services.yaml files are, again, sort of the way of registering things for dependency injection, which again, we'll get into the details a little bit when we talk about how to consume these things, how to make your own services, how to consume them in the various different ways that they are consumed. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about dependency injection in that context too.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth, just since we're kind of in the defining and justifying mode, talking about that weird phrase of dependency injection, because that maybe is one of the biggest obstacles, is that doesn't seem to make any sense. So a dependency in this case is you saying your code needs some other code in order to do its work, or some other functionality, data, whatever. And so that is the dependency. And normally, when you are not using this pattern, if you were, again, thinking in the more procedural way, or even an object-oriented way that's not using this pattern, you do have dependencies on other code. And when you need that code, you explicitly say, give me one of those now. And you say that by explicitly telling the programming language that what the name of that thing and where to find it. But here the idea is we're flipping that on its head. So you're saying what your dependencies are, but you're not being specific about where those things are located. You're giving them labels so that the framework, the container in this case, can offer them to you. And you don't have to care about what specific flavor of that thing is being offered to you, as long as it satisfies the interface that you asked for.
Yeah, so in going back to everything we've said, so far leading up to this, again, it's not only a dependency on that specific thing, but a dependency on the knowledge required in order to use it or to create one of them. So I need to know not only that this class implements it, but I need to know how to create these things that I've got to pass to its constructor. And so the dependency gets chained down, and I am dependent on a lot of knowledge in order to use this thing. And so if we, again, dependency injection is the idea of, rather than me having a dependency on that dependency gets injected into my code rather than me having to go out and create it. And that's where that term comes from. And again, typically that's done in the constructor. It gets injected into the constructor. But
yeah,
in this case,
you still have the dependency. You just don't need to worry about dealing with satisfying the dependency.
Yes, correct. And so if you think about this, in a practical sense, this particular class here, which is part of this module. So this is custom code, but it has these three things that it uses. But at some point that might change, and maybe that code doesn't need the request stack anymore. And so now, if you had created this with an equal new statement and passed it those three parameters, now everywhere where you're using that is now broken, and you have to go recreate. You have to go change that code and rewrite it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's probably a pretty good spot to leave this. We'll tease what's coming next. So so we're going to be talking about creating your own service and how to declare these dependencies so that they can be provided by the container and you can use them. And then we're also going to talk about things that aren't services in Drupal that also consume these dependencies, because there are other kinds of classes, notably plugins like blocks and fields that you would define all the time, that can also take advantage of all of these same concepts.
And I think we'll talk about different ways to get to them too, because Drupal provides a couple of different paths to get to them. So that'll be the nuts and bolts of how to use them, and why you may want to do one versus the other, and when you have to do one versus the other.
All right.
So stay tuned. Come back.
Yeah, stay tuned. Exactly. So thanks as always. And if you have any requests for topics that you'd like to see covered, or if there's something you'd like to cover yourself, please feel free to leave that information on the Meetup group or on the YouTube page. Thank you.